How's it going, everybody? Cirrus here, and I've had a few requests in the comment section to talk about how to build a more consistent commander deck, so I want to go ahead and talk about that right now. We all like playing this format for one reason or another, and I'm sure it feels horrible when your deck just stops working. It stops functioning as a deck and starts feeling weird. Or maybe you have a precon that you've been upgrading, and there's a certain point in time where the deck stopped working the way you intended it to. There's a lot of reasons why a deck might not feel as consistent as it should. When you reach those times, this is a guide that will hopefully get you through that. So, what's the first rule when creating a very consistent commander deck? Start with a game plan. It sounds really weird, but I'm not lying. Start with a game plan instead of a commander. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say that you're wanting to build Savra, Queen of the Golgari. Are you building a Savra deck? No, you're building an aristocrat deck where Savra is going to be supported by things like Zulaport Cutthroat and the Fleshbag Marauder. That is the deck that you're building, a deck with lots of aristocrats and sacrifice synergies. Now, why do we build a deck this way? Well, if you build a deck this way, the deck will stand on its own two legs even when your commander is dead. You want to build Miriam Sentinel Worm, that's fine. You're not just putting clones in there and dragons in there to benefit off of Miriam, though. If you have dragons that have strong enough ETBs and clones that are efficient enough on their mana curve, then you should be able to, even in the games where Miriam is destroyed, you should be able to eke out a win based on the merit and power of the cards that are just in your deck in general. Yeah, Miriam creates a lot of clones, but you've got other clones you have access to. You've got big dragons you've got access to. Remember, commanders are the most played bit of cardboard in this format. They are often the strongest piece in your deck or the linchpin to your strategy, but your deck should build and flow with a solid game plan irrespective of your commander. They shouldn't fold the second your commander dies, because even though commanders are going to be the cards that are played the most often, they are also the cards that are likely going to die the most often, either by incremental board wipes happening or being hit by your opponent's Pongify. Your commander is a strong card, but your deck should function without your commander. It should not require your commander in order to exist. The next thing we need to talk about are your lands. Lands are incredibly important, and you should stop cutting them out of your deck. You need mana to cast spells, but we get tempted to run less and less mana pieces because we want to fit in more cool spells. We want to be able to play more big dragons, so we're going to cut lands to make room for those dragons. We always get tempted to do this. And unfortunately, we end up falling for what's called the sharpshooter fallacy because of it. Sometimes your deck overperforms, but that doesn't mean that it's not falling short other times, or even most times. For those who don't know, the sharpshooter fallacy is the idea that if a gunman is shooting the side of a barn and then draws targets around the bullet hole clusters, of course it looks like he hit more targets. If you're only focusing on the games where your deck overperformed, that doesn't mean you have a strong deck. That means you have a deck that has high variance and not a lot of consistency. A good starting point would be to build a deck that has 37 lands. Now, decks that have landfall synergies like AC might want more lands than that, and say aristocrat decks may end up wanting fewer lands than that because their mana curve tends to be so low. But generally speaking, 37 lands is a good, solid starting area that you can build from. Now, the next important part, though, is about ramp. We're going to talk about ramp more later, but first of all, I need to say this. Ramp doesn't replace lands. Cutting a land for a Nature's Lore or a Farseek does not suddenly make your deck better. This is because playing lands on curve is incredibly strong. If you run out of lands, casting something like Farseek does not replace the mana that you otherwise would have had to spend on stronger spells. It just means that your turn 2 that you could have spent playing a different card is being spent playing Farseek now, or a Solemn Simulacrum. You're playing cards that should have just been lands. This doesn't mean you shouldn't run Ramp. Ramp is important to run. It lets you stay on curve with other players. But you're going to end up feeling a turn or two behind if you don't have enough lands in your deck, and if you're casting ramp on turns that you otherwise would have just been playing lands. Also, while we're on the subject of lands, please stop playing tapped lands. Tapped lands are really, really slow, and they make turns function as if you're a turn behind on mana. If I'm playing a tapped land 3 or 4 turns into the game, it's no different than me just missing that land drop over and over and over again. If you've got to run tapped lands, ask yourself these questions. Do they offer some advantage akin to casting a spell, like Bojuka Bog? Do they allow you to replace them later in the game when you get mana flooded, like, say, the Triome cycle does? Are they modal, and as modal cards can be used as a spell or a land when necessary, like Malakir Rebirth? And can you mitigate the tapping effect because of your commander? Say you're playing AC deck and you've got Tangled Islet in there. It's a typed land, and also you're playing enough lands to mitigate that tapping anyway. Finally, is the land typed? Cards like Haunted Mire and Tangled Islet are actually pretty good. In Simic decks that have access to Wood Elves, Nature's Lore, Farseek, you're going to try to get a bunch of lands out of your deck with these, and it feels better to get all of the dual lands out of your deck. Cards like Farseek are already getting those lands onto the battlefield tapped anyway, so there's no real problem with playing tapped lands if you're getting them with a card like this. Dual lands are important, but lands that can act as multiple kinds of lands in your deck are also super important. If you've seen my budget builds, then you also know that I tend to run things like Promising Vein in a lot of my decks. And the reason that I do that is because cards like Promising Vein can be any type of land in our deck. And because they can be any type of land in our deck, we get to gain all kinds of benefits by playing them. The next thing we need to ask ourselves is, are we playing enough draw power in our deck? Now, I know this feels really, really basic, right? Making a deck more consistent by drawing more cards. Who's reinventing the wheel now? But we need to also define draw power to help us a little bit here. What is draw and what's not draw? Cards like Opt and Consider, they are not draw. These are powerful cards. Cards like Ponder are powerful cards. But if we have 5 cards in our hand the turn we cast Ponder, we will end up, in most situations, with 5 cards in our hand after we cast Ponder. Cards like Thrill of Possibility are also not really draw cards. We can cast them, and they will give us the exact same amount of cards that we are throwing away when we cast them. We throw away 2 cards for Thrill of Possibility, we get 2 cards when we get it. Now, we can circumvent this by playing decks that give us lots of advantage by using these cards. So Opt isn't really a draw spell unless it's being backed up by something like Double Vision. Thrill of Possibility isn't really a draw spell unless it's being backed up by a reanimation strategy where our graveyard is basically a second hand, and throwing a big creature into the graveyard benefits us. In most situations, we want our ramp to be things like Harmonize or Ambition's Cost. Not specifically these are very low power budget cards, but we want them to be cards that when we play them, we are guaranteed to get 2 or 3 more cards in our hand than the turn that we dropped them on the board. It's okay to run even budget draw spells if you are running them over things like Opt or Consider in decks that really need draw and not what these actually are. These are cantrips. It's a good rule of thumb to have about 10 draw power cards in your deck, unless your commander is a draw power commander. Then you can run a little lower because you're guaranteed to have that commander eventually. Next, we need to talk about ramp and what ramp actually is. I tend to run about 10 to 13 ramp cards in decks that have 37 lands. I also try to get close to half my deck being mana sources if possible, but we still need to define ramp. Ramp is a card that gets a land out of our deck, like Search for Tomorrow, and puts it on the battlefield. This puts us a land ahead of what we would be normally on curve. If we play Search for Tomorrow on turn 4, then on turn 5, we'll actually have 6 lands if we haven't missed any of our land drops. What's not ramp, though? Cards like Mycosynth Wellspring and Armillary Sphere are not ramp. They get us lands, yes. They allow us to guarantee that we are hitting our land drops, yes. But these do not significantly change the amount of lands on the board. No matter how many times we cast Mycosynth Wellspring or Armillary Sphere, we aren't going to end up ahead on available mana of our opponents. We're going to just be on curve. There's nothing wrong with being on curve, but the definition of ramp is going ahead of the curve, accelerating your curve. But what is good ramp? we want our ramp to have a particular rate of return. So a good rate of return for me is 2 mana per card. So Rampant Growth is 2 mana and gets us 1 land. That's a good rate of return for me. Search for Tomorrow costs 3 mana, but it can cost 1 mana if we suspend it, which gives it a better rate of return. Also, Search gets the land untapped, so a turn where we cast Rampant Growth and a turn where we cast Search for Tomorrow, we end up with the same amount of available mana either way. Skyshroud Claim is a really good return on investment. We spend 4 mana to get 2 mana on the board, and that mana comes into play untapped, so we now have access to it. Solemn Simulacrum is a good return on investment, because even though it's 4 mana to get 1 mana out of our deck, we also get the ability to draw, and we get death synergies that cards like Solemn Simulacrum give us. Also, the Sad Robot can be used and abused in decks that aren't green, which is really important. Now, what is an example of bad ramp? I'm going to give you one, and this will cover basically all of it. Cards like Explosive Vegetation are bad ramp. Yes, these do fall under our 2 mana per land we get out of the deck clause, but what do we want to be doing on turn 4? We don't want to be casting ramp on turn 4. On turn 4, we want to be casting spells to keep up with our opponent. If we play Explosive Vegetation, that's our turn. If we're casting Rampant Growth on turn 2, that's fine. Unless people are playing Aristocrats or other low-to-the-ground commanders, they're also ramping on turn 2 because they're using things like Arcane Signet. Mana Rocks are also good ramp. 2 mana for every 1 mana you get out of a Mana Rock is a really good rate of return. These are the kinds of ramp you should be playing. This is the reason why people have issues with 3 mana Mana Rocks. Not only are they artifacts and they're subject to more removal than lands, but they give us a bad rate of return. 3 mana for 1 available mana is only a good rate of return in certain situations, like with Search for Tomorrow. Generally speaking, though, if we're on a budget, we might lean into those 3 mana Mana Rocks, and if we are trying to get certain utility, we might lean into those Mana Rocks that give us that utility. You've seen the videos where I've talked about Honored Heirloom, so I won't go any further on this one. The next thing we need to talk about is card choice. So, what do I mean? Well, let's see here. Let's ask ourselves a question, and let's use Swords to Plowshare as our example. So, when you're selecting a card for your deck, you have to ask yourselves a few questions. The first question is, does this card serve multiple functions within my deck? The second question is, does this card get me closer to my endgame? And the last one is, do better alternatives to this card exist? So, do better alternatives to Swords of Plowshare exist? No. It is the strongest white removal spell next to Path to Exile, in my opinion. For creatures, it is the best at what it does. But is it the best thing we could be running in that deck? Sometimes no. Sometimes you need something like Generous Gift. This can destroy any permanent, including a land. Yes, Swords to Plowshare is the premier white removal for creatures, but for 2 more mana, you have the ability to hit your opponent's Maze's End. You have the ability to kill your opponent's Bolas's Citadel. You have the ability to knock Omniscience off the board before the opponent goes crazy with it. If you're running mono white, run both. But if you're running a deck that has multiple colors and you have to pick and choose, sometimes it's better to pick and choose the cards that can kill multiple types of cards than the cards that are literally the best at what they do in a narrow category. The next thing to consider is mana curve. So when we're playing a deck, we want to make sure that our mana curve is understood. Yes, you can play really big cards that cost a lot of mana and might win you the game, but if you never see them, I mean, when are you planning on playing them? When you're dead? If your deck is filled with high mana clunky spells, you're not going to cast those cards at any point. You're just going to die before you cast them and go to your next game. A good idea when you are choosing cards in your deck is make sure that your cards follow a bell curve. So if we look at my Windgrace deck, it has a fairly sharp bell curve curving out at 3 mana. If we look at my Lathril deck, it also has a bit of a smoother bell curve curving out at 3 mana as well. But if we go to look at something like Eowyn, this is an aggro deck. An aggro deck's bell curve is going to look a little different. Aggro deck's curves looks a little more like this. Lots of low-cost cards curving down. One of the other curves that you might see in a deck If you are cheating out cards of high mana value, your curve might look something like this. A lot of cards in the category where you're cheating cards out, and then a bunch of cards in a bunch of higher mana categories. But if your deck does not specifically cheat out high mana cards, you want your bell curve to be, you want your curve to look like this. You want your curve to be a nice slope where you've got a couple plays you can make on turn 1, a few plays you can make on turn 2, a lot of potential options on turn 3, and then slowly going down where you've got a couple big spells you can play, big haymakers late in the game. By making sure that your deck has a good curve when you're selecting your cards, you'll guarantee that your deck is much, much more powerful. It'll flow much better. Now, for cards that get us closer to our end game, we need to ask ourselves, how are they doing this? Do they summon a type of creature that our commander wants, like Omnath Locus of Rage? In a landfall strategy, this just wins us the game over time. Are they cards like Sir Conrad that, if they are left undisputed, will create a winning board state by just existing on the board? Are the cards in our deck cards that require our commander to be out, like a landfall deck really wanting Tatiova to be out? Or are they cards that exist in a deck like Mishra, where the commander can die multiple times and it doesn't really affect you that much? Decks like Tatiova and AC can have the commander die multiple times as well without really hurting themselves too much. But let's say you've got a commander like Sheoldred the Apocalypse. She has a very, very particular ability, and we're going to switch her to one you can actually read here. Her ability is whenever you draw a card, gain 2 life, and whenever your opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. This is a linchpin commander. But what happens when Sheoldred dies? The type of deck that Sheoldred is playing in is making your opponents draw lots of cards. So what happens when they're drawing lots of cards and not being punished for it? You are in a losing situation. Like, you are just losing there. For decks that have commanders like these that are linchpins, make sure that your deck is including lieutenants like Underworld Dreams, cards that do what your commander does and can exist on the board when your commander's not there and provide the same benefit to you. Otherwise, make sure they are cards that can exist on their own, like Wolverine Riders, and give you a ton of advantage without you having to worry too much about them. Cards like Wolverine Riders and Academy Manufacturer will synergize in the decks that they are in, the token decks and the elf decks respectively, without you needing to have your commander out. These are the cards that will slowly eke us closer to our endgame. Cards that will slowly get us to the point where we just win the game, with them being out on their own. Cards like Bolas' Citadel are also wonderful for this. Make sure that the cards that you're running in your deck have a purpose. They either synergize with your commander super well, or on their own, they can pilot you to victory. And again, please play secondary commanders. If you're playing AC, put a Tatiova in your slot as well. If you're playing Vran, put a Sir Conrad in your slot as well. If you're playing Sheoldred, put an Underworld Dreams in your slot as well. Make sure that you have lieutenants available for you. If a card does not support our commander, it should function without the commander, or just win us the game on its own. Cards like this are cards that have, give us ramp or draw power, like we talked about before. Cards that give us interaction, like Generous Gift. These are cards that interact well on their own. These are cards that will slot into just about any deck. And that brings us to our next point. All right, now we have to talk about slotting. This is the most important part of the entire video. Bookmark this part if you really need to, but we need to talk about how to sort your deck. Now, when you sort your deck, how do you sort it? Do you sort it into piles like instants, sorceries, and creatures? Well, I can tell you right now, those ratios don't matter at all. Having more creatures or more instants in your deck only matters in decks that specifically want those numbers or variables. But for the most part, your deck's ratios, the thing that matters the most is what the cards do. Now, what does that mean? Well, consider that any video that I've done on a deck, I've talked about decks in terms of what cards do. This is our draw power section. I have 10 draw cards in Eowyn. This is our ramp section. There are 12 cards in this ramp section. Here are our surprise win cons right here. These are the cards that will win us the game if left unchecked. What is our removal? We have 10 removal in this deck that will allow us to keep our board states under wraps. Those are the things that we need to be considering when we are building decks. Not how many instants or sorceries we have, but how many cards that serve particular functions do we have? Now, if a card serves multiple functions, simply ask yourself, what is it going to be doing more often than not? Sure, I can summon my Knight of the White Orchid and I can use it as an aggro card because it's got first strike, but primarily, what is it doing? It's coming onto the board and getting me a land, so it goes into the ramp slot. This will make sure you've got a good idea of what function every card in your deck primarily serves. And if you can't figure out where a card goes, maybe it might not need to be in your deck at all. Unless, of course, we're talking about the last section for slotting, which is synergy. So, for instance, Eowyn is an aggro deck, so there are 11 cards in here that are lords. They give power to multiple creatures. 4 cards in here give extra combats. These allow the multiple creatures on the board to have more chances of hitting your opponent. Then we've got protection, cards that make sure that Eowyn, the linchpin of the deck strategy, and your board at large will not be destroyed. If we have our deck sorted into these areas, it will be much easier for us to understand what our deck is trying to do, as opposed to our deck being a pile of cards that we just happen to like. So, how would we go about the ratios for this? A good starting place for me would be about 10 draw spells, 10 ramp spells, 12 interaction spells, 3 board wipes, 3 surprise win cons, 25 cards that synergize with the deck's strategy, broken down into about no more than 3 or 4 sections. If we look at Eowyn, we've got protection for Eowyn, we've got lords for Eowyn, we've got combats for Eowyn, and then the last thing that's in here is token generators for Eowyn. There's 4 specific synergies in the deck, but one of them is literally just protecting the commander. So this is a pseudo synergy. We are looking at basically 3 major synergies. We are looking at tokens that are being generated. We are looking at attack power to make the tokens bigger, and extra combats to make the tokens hit more often. These are the deck's synergies. These are the things it's trying to accomplish. And then finally, like I said, about 37 lands. I've got about 37 lands in the Eowyn deck, actually, come to think of it. This will guarantee that we hit all of our stuff. Now, these numbers are not final, but they are a good starting point to build from. Again, in Eowyn, I have 4 different synergy areas because protecting the board state is really important. If you're playing an Aristocrats deck, you might run fewer lands and more interaction. If you're running a Landfall deck, you might run more ramp and less of other cards, more lands, for instance. But generally speaking, 10 draw, 10 ramp, 12 interaction, 3 win cons, 3 board wipes, 25 synergies, and 37 lands will get us where we need to go. Also, remember, your commander should count as one of those synergy cards. Otherwise, it's in the wrong place. This will make sure that our decks don't lack focus. This will make sure that decks feel right in our hands. Too often, decks that we've modified a lot start feeling clunky, like we don't have enough ramp or draw, or the choices we put in the deck lack focus. By divvying our deck up into these slots, we guarantee that the deck will flow right. The last thing that you have to ask yourself, and this one's really hard to quantify, what power level are you building to? Every player you play with is different. Every table you play at is different. But if you're running a CEDH table, you'll want like 30 interaction cards, no deck synergies, and a ton of infinite combos, and tutors to get up to your game plan. But if you're not doing that, ask yourself, what turn is your deck trying to win by? Is it trying to win on turn 5? Is it trying to win on turn 10? Do you even know how early your deck can win? How much fast mana or stacks pieces are you loading your deck with? The more you add, the stronger your deck is by default. The faster your deck can win consistently, the earlier the turn number that your deck can win on, the stronger your deck will be by default. Make sure that you're communicating with your table about what kind of deck you are building. My Eowyn deck can win on turn 6 or 7, but usually it's going to win on like turn 10 if it gets there. So I know that the power level of that deck is strong enough to play at almost any casual table, but it's not going to break into a CDH table at any point. I know that, both from testing the deck out locally, and that's how it was built. I know the things that are put in there. If you are building your deck, don't try to quantify your deck by going, oh, my deck's a 7, because everybody's deck is a 7 on the power level. Everybody will bullshit their way into saying their deck's a 7. If you're running a lot of stacks pieces like Draenith Magistrate, or if you're running a lot of fast mana like Mana Crypt, your deck is stronger by default. The more of that you add to your deck, the stronger your deck will be, because it is either slowing everybody down or it is speeding you up past them. If your deck is consistently winning at earlier turns, your deck is simply stronger. If your deck doesn't have a way to close out the game until turn 20, it's not a really strong deck at all. I would argue maybe you should build a new deck at that point, because you either have to run enough stacks pieces to survive to that turn, or you're just playing the most painstaking version of Magic the Gathering possible and maybe play away from me. But anyway, these are the steps that I use when building a deck, and I hope that they will help you in building your decks. Make sure that your ratios are right, make sure you're running enough lands, make sure your decks are running with a game plan, not just a generic idea around what your commander does. Make sure you're building with focus, and hopefully this will help you build better commander decks. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, hit the like button if you haven't already, and as always everybody, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here, and they would be Red Joker, Britzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Nabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sagitt, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.